Hello, my name is Yuro and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video, I'd like to show you my Ifan Mezd build, which is another build inspired by the Divinity Original Sin 2 game. And in this case, Ifan actually translates quite well into Baldur's Gate 3, mainly because we have, he identifies as a Wayfarer, and the closest thing we can get to a Wayfarer is a Ranger. And on top of that, he has a pet Source Wolf, and we can, in Baldur's Gate 3, we can be a Ranger Beastmaster and we can run around with a companion Wolf. So for our character creation, as a race, we're going as a human, since Ifan is a human. We gain a human versatility feature, which is actually quite nice. We gain additional skill to be proficient in, and we increase our carrying capacity by a quarter. Then for the second one, we have the Civil Militia. Now this won't matter too much, as we'll be proficient with most of weapons and armors in the game, since we are of course a ranger. Now for the class, as mentioned, we're going as a ranger. For the favorite enemy, there are a few choices. So you can go as the bounty hunter. What bounty hunter does is gives you proficiency in investigation, which is very useful, and also makes it so that enemies have disadvantage in their saving throws on your ensnaring strike, so you can keep them pinned into place a lot easier. Second one, relatively decent, is the Keeper of the Veil. Your specialist hunting creatures in other planes of existence, so we gain proficiency in Arcana, which is okay. It's not too great, but we do get a protection from evil and good once, as for a spell slot. So this is a really useful defensive spell. And then lastly, the one we would go for is the Ranger Knight. Basically, this gives us proficiency in history, which is not that great, but then we gain proficiency in heavy armor. Now, we would want heavy armor because there is actually quite nice heavy armor in the game that's going to be very nice for us, which is going to cause enemies to reel when they hit us. And then if we combo it with one of our crossbows, for example, we can cause reeling when we hit them. So for this first favorite enemy, I would suggest going as a Ranger Knight, because then you can start wearing heavy armor in Act 1 when you deal with the Forge, and then later on as we level up, we'll get another pointed favorite enemy, and then we'll get either the Bounty Hunter or the Keeper of the Veil. It's going to be up to you, but for the first one, I would suggest either going with either one of those three. It's completely up to you. I'll just take Ranger Knight for this example. For the Natural Explorer, there are only really two of the ones worth taking. Now, Beast Tamer you could take, but it's not really worth it. It lets you cast Find Familiar without expending a spell slot, and Familiars are relatively weak as they don't scale. Of course, they're a first level spell, so it's not that great. Urban Tracker is okay if you need a backup sleight of hand character, because this gives you proficiency in sleight of hand. But the two best ones are Fire and Poison, because Fire and Poison are the two most common damage types in the game. Fire is by far the most common, but then Poison is the close second. So for this first Natural Explorer, I would suggest picking up the Natural Wasteland Wanderer Fire, so we get fire resistance. For our background now, Ifan is a soldier and an outlaw in Divinity Original Sin. And here, for this example, I went with the soldier one because it's quite fitting for him. He is a member of the Lone Wolves, basically a mercenary company that's pretty militaristic, I would say. And then for our ability scores, we're going with 10 Strength, 17 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 16 Wisdom. 10 Strength is here just to help us a little bit with our carry weight, because we will be carrying around some weapon coatings and special arrows. Dexterity, of course, our main combat stat, because we're going to be using this to shoot our crossbow, and of course we gain extra initiative, which we want to have quite a bit of. Constitution 14, we want this to basically, well, we don't need it to be as high, as we won't be that reliant on concentrating on spells, because we primarily will be using level 1 or 2 spells, and we have plenty of those throughout the long rest. And then Wisdom 16, we want this to be relatively high so that our spell save DC for the Ensnaring Strike is also quite decent. Now for our proficiencies, we have quite a few choices. Stealth I would ignore most likely. Investigation we get from if we choose one of the favorite enemies, which is pretty good. Nature we could really ignore. Animal handling as well. But since we do have insight and perception here, these are both quite good. And I would pick survival here if you don't have it. If you chose a different race for whatever reason, you might have different choices. But insight and perception, I would highly suggest you pick up when possible. And then for the rest of these, it's going to be basically up to you what you prefer. I like having one character with proficiency in survival, even though you can just dig a rough area around where you know the bird cache is to dig it up, instead of actually having to perceive where it is. Now we have athletics and intimidation proficiency from our background. So yeah, if you do choose, of course, you can always pick up a background of your preference. It's completely up to you. It's not really something that makes or breaks a build. Alright, so at level 2 we unlock a fighting style and we also get our ranger spellcasting. Now for the spells, we're gonna go for the probably two most obvious choices here, which will be Hunter's Mark and Ensnaring Strike. Hunter's Mark is gonna be probably the most main spell we're gonna be concentrating on. It's gonna actually synergize quite well with our boots. And Ensnaring Strike is useful against enemies that have low strength, because high strength enemies are more likely to succeed. Therefore, probably wasting this on them isn't too useful, but anyone who has low strength saving throws, this is a really nice one to get free or nearly free advantage on them. For our fighting style, of course, we're gonna go as archer. We're gonna be focusing pretty much exclusively on shooting with our crossbow, and one of our feats is gonna allow us to even shoot in melee with our crossbow. At level 3, we unlock our subclass and we get an additional spell slot. And here you could pick up Speak with Animals if you want to. It casts you, basically it's a ritual spell, so it won't cost you a spell slot during if you're using this outside of combat. Ifan is also a great character if you need Long Strider, but if you don't have a character with it in the party. So for this example, I'll just pick up Long Strider here because it's such a useful spell. And of course, it is a free spell because it's a ritual spell when you cast it outside of combat. For our subclass, we are going as a Beastmaster. This allows us to summon a companion, which they level up along with you, but certain breakpoints. So they're not every level, but they do keep up with you. So they are quite useful still. At level 4, we unlock our first feat, and here we're going to go with ability improvement +2 into dexterity. It's going to help us with our battle prowess. It's going to also give us a little bit of extra armor class if we're using medium armor or light armor. Well, specific medium armors, and of course, or light armor. We can at this point or at level 5 deal with Auntie Ethel to get a +1 into dexterity. And then we can, of course, further increase our dexterity by taking up the memory of a thief in the Mirror of Loss in Act 3. So we can get our dexterity up to 22, which is our sort of end goal for this character. At level 5, we unlock our extra attack. We unlock the subclass feature of Companion's Bond. So what it does is our proficiency bonus is added to their armor and damage roll. So our companion has a little bit of more armor class, and they have a little bit of better damage, which is pretty good. We unlock our second level spells, and here I would actually just picking up Silence. Silence is a quite useful one throughout some parts of the game, especially the big boss fight in the Grim Forge. Because if you're playing on honor mode, then that character has legendary action. He deals thunder damage, and this basically nullifies that legendary action. It's also useful to silence characters who can sometimes call for help, or if they are spellcasters and similar. Another great pick here is the Spike Growth. It's a huge area effect that slows enemies, and it also deals damage to them whenever they walk over it. So for the first one, I would suggest either one of these two. At level 6, we unlock our second favorite enemy here, and here you can go either Bounty Hunter or Keeper of the Veil. If you find yourself using a lot of the Ensnaring Strike, then go Bounty Hunter. If you primarily just use Hunter's Mark, then you might as well go Keeper of the Veil. And then if you need to, you can cast the Protection from Evil and Good, because you have to keep in mind, both Hunter's Mark, Ensnaring Strike, and Protection from Evil and Good are concentration spells, but we benefit from them regardless because our boots are going to synergize with all of them basically. So it's up to you which one of these you want to take. I will take Keeper of the Veil in this example. For the Natural Explorer, we're going to take Poison. Poison is pretty good to have resistance against because, well, there's a certain hag enemy or a fey enemy that likes to deal poison damage, and this is useful against that character. At level 7, we unlock the Exceptional Terrain, so now our companion can use Dash, Disengage, and Help as a bonus action. So this is actually quite useful because now they can dash and then still use their action to attack, or they can help you or your companions of the party to get them from a wounded state, which is pretty nice. Now for our second spell here, you could pick up Dark Vision if you don't have elixirs of it, or preferably if you want to have scrolls of Dark Vision. You could also take Lesser Restoration. This can be quite helpful against enemies that like to paralyze you or restrain or give you blindness. So this is also a nice pickup. But what I'm gonna take is what we potentially picked up earlier, is the Spike Growth, which is a really nice area effect denial spell. At level 8, we unlock the Landstride Difficult Terrain, so now basically difficult terrain doesn't slow us down, and it's going to synergize amazingly with our boots because our boots prevent us from being, basically from slipping and falling if you're traversing ice or grease, for example. For our second feat, here we're gonna go with the Sharpshooter. What Sharpshooter does is you can take a -5 penalty to your accuracy, but you deal extra 10 damage, and you can toggle this effect on or off. We also do not receive penalties from high ground, and of course, Actually, that's crossbow expert, where it doubles the gaping wounds effect, so we're gonna get to that in a bit. At level 9, we unlock our 3rd level spells, and here you have a few choices. So you could pick up the Daylight, which is useful in Act 3 against a certain vampiric enemy. Otherwise, you could also take the Lightning Arrow or the Conjure Barrage. This is a good AoE area to deal to a lot of enemies. Same thing with Lightning Arrow, although you probably would want to use your weapon action instead. You could take Plant Growth, which does make it into a difficult terrain, which you are immune against. Protection from energy is not all that great. It just, of course, grants you resistance to 8 element type, but as long as you're concentrating on it. So for this example, I'll just take the Conjure Barrage. At level 10, we get another favorite enemy, and here we're going to be picking up the last one, which is the Bounty Hunter. Again, you could have picked them up in the same order as I have, or completely different order. It's completely up to you, whichever one you want to prefer. Now, Magebreaker and Side Effect Stoker, I don't think are really good. Magebreaker gives you proficiency in Arcana and you gain True Strike. True Strike is pretty bad as it's an action and gives you advantage. So basically you spend a turn to gain advantage next turn, but you could have just shot those 2 turns anyway, right? So it doesn't really end up being that great. And then Sanctify Stalker gives you proficiency in Religion, which is pretty bad, and gives you Sacred Flame, which, yeah, isn't all that great either. And then lastly, we have Natural Explorer again. So here we could pick up Cold, or you might as well pick up one of these other ones. I'm just going to go with the Cold. So now we have all of these resistances to all of those element types. Then at level 11, our companion gets boosted even further. So now they have unlocked extra attacks. So they have even more, a little bit of more damage, which is pretty good. And then we unlock an additional spell. So here I'm just going to take, I would suggest either taking Lightning Arrow or Daylight. You will be well off into Act 3 already. So potentially picking up Daylight if you don't have anybody is quite useful against the Nocturnal type enemies. So I'm going to go with Daylight here. And finally at level 12, we don't unlock a new spell slot, but we do get another feat. And here we're going with Crossbow Expert. So what it does is we don't have this advantage when are attacking with our crossbow in melee. And also our piercing shot inflicts gaping wounds for twice as long, which is pretty good. So that means you deal that extra 2 piercing damage or that extra 2 damage for 2 turns more, which it can end up being quite a lot of bonus damage depending on how many different instances of damage you get onto the target, right? So this is a really good feat. All right, so that is it for the levels. I will now see you in the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in the equipment section, so let's start with our headgear. Here I have the Circle of Hunting. You gain 1d4 bonus to attack rolls against creatures that are marked by Hunter's Mark, 2 Strikes, Fairy Fire, or Guiding Bolt. So this is a decent little headpiece there that you can get for extra accuracy against creatures that you or allies mark with these other various status effects. I found myself using Hunter's Mark quite a bit, so this was quite helpful for me. Some alternatives you can take is the Haste Helm in the early game, which gives you momentum for 3 turns at the start, so you gain extra 15 speed at the first turn. Then for the late game, you can take the Mask of Soul Perception, which gives you +2 to attack rolls and initiative, which is pretty good. Then we have the Steel Watcher Helmet. This is a great one because it makes you immune to blinded and you can see in the dark up to 40 feet. Since as a human we don't have dark vision, this basically boosts all of those. And on top of that, it gives you advantage on Constitution saving throws, so we get advantage on concentration saving throws. And then lastly, you could take the Saravok's Horn Helmet, which again gives you dark vision, but only up to 10 feet. So it's a little bit less, it's not 40, but it's 10. It also reduces our roll required for a critical hit by 1, which is pretty nice, and we can't be frightened or we cannot be afflicted by any other emotion-altering condition, which this is a pretty good helmet as well. Then for our cloak, I went with the Flesh Melter Cloak. Whenever a creature deals melee damage to the wearer, that creature takes 1d4 acid damage. I just took this because, honestly, there aren't too many that great ones. You could take Cloak of Displacement, which is a pretty good defensive one, which gives enemies disadvantage on tackles against you. So this one is also this one is actually pretty good for Ifan. And of course, as always, with pretty much any character, Cloak of Protection is a great one to pick up, regardless what your character is. For the armor, I went with the Adamantine Splint armor. So what it does, it reduces incoming damage by 2, and also when a melee attack hits you, the attacker is sent rolling for 3 turns, which then gives them a -3 penalty to their attack roll, so they're more likely to miss. So this is a pretty good, very good armor that basically punishes enemies. If they hit you, you take reduced damage, and then they're more likely to miss on their next attack. And on top of that, they cannot land critical hits on us. Now, if you don't end up picking up the Ranger Knight feature, where we don't get heavy armor proficiency, you can pick up the Adamantine Scale Mail, which is basically the same thing, just a little bit of weaker in effect. So reduces damage by 1 instead of 2, and then you send enemies reeling for 2 turns instead of 3, so it's a -2 instead of -3, and again, they can't land critical hits on you. And then another great one is the UNT Scale Melt. Gives you extra initiative, which is pretty nice, and it adds our full dexterity modifier to the armor class, so we're gonna get a 6 armor class instead of the usual 2. For gloves, I went with the Bone Spike gloves. Your attacks ignore resistance to slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning. These are actually quite amazing for Ifan, for example, especially if you combo it with a character who wears the Ballist's armor, because then he will always deal double damage to enemies that receive vulnerability to piercing. Because you ignore resistance if they have it, and then they take double damage because of the vulnerability. So these are great. There aren't too many ways of making your piercing damage ignore resistances, so these gloves are actually pretty amazing for that. So for some early game alternatives, we have the gloves of archery. You gain proficiency with longbows and shortbows, and then we also deal additional 2 damage with ranged attacks. Now, of course, we wouldn't really care for that proficiency, but that 2 extra damage is actually quite nice. And then we have the Dark Justiciar gauntlets and the Lord Helda's gloves. Same reason, they give us 1d4 in necrotic damage for the gauntlets. And then for the Helda's gloves, we gain 1d4 fire damage with our weapon attacks, which is pretty nice. Then for our boots, we have the Boots of Striding. So these are going to be the main boots we want to run. When we cast a spell that requires concentration, we gain +1 to momentum, which is pretty decent. We gain 5 extra speed. But the main effect we want is the one that makes us immune to falling prone or being moved against our will while we are concentrating, which is going to be basically all the time. So in combination with the Landstrider free movement feat, we now can move on, let's say, grease or ice freely without having to worry about falling prone, which is pretty powerful. For the amulet, I went with the Broodmother's Revenge. Whenever the wearer is healed, the weapon becomes coated in magic and deals additional 1d6 poison damage. So if you, for example, don't have any coatings, or situationally you don't want to run any of these coatings in the game, you could drink a potion of healing and then gain 1d6 bonus poison damage to your attacks, which is pretty nice. If you find yourself, of course, using a lot of coatings, you can use some of the alternatives like the Amulet of the Harpers, which gives you shield and advantage on Wisdom saving throw checks, or for the same reason, Face Amulet's Amulet, which gives you advantage on Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma saving throws, which is pretty useful both for saving against mental spells or mental saving throws. And then lastly, we have the Amulet of the Unworthy, which makes us resistant to slashing but vulnerable to bludgeoning. Bludgeoning is probably the least common damage type in the game, but of course you have to worry about it. If you do end up fighting an enemy that is heavy bludgeoning damage, then of course you want to unequip this, otherwise he will deal quite a lot of damage to you. For the rings, we got the Strange Conduit ring. While attacking while concentrating on a spell, the wearer's weapon attacks deal additional 1d4 psychic damage, and of course the acoustic band, our weapon attacks deal additional 2 acid damage. So we are actually trying to boost our crossbow damage quite a bit with a bunch of these various different effects. So we ignore resistances, and then we deal extra 1d6 poison damage, potentially 1d4 psychic damage when we are concentrating, which should be all the time, and then lastly additional 2 acid damage with just the acoustic band. So we should be having quite a high damage output when all of these buffs are present. For our weapons, I went with the Laretian's Wrath. This is a finesse longsword, which is the one of only 2 ones that exist in game. You potentially can go with any other melee weapon. Basically, just if you don't go for this, you go for Valar Luve or any other melee weapon that you might use as a stat stick in the game. So it's completely up to you here. It doesn't really matter all that much. Then for the shield, I went with the Swire's Sledboard. The shield shrouds the wearer with Force Conduit at the start of its turn in combat. So every turn in combat, we gain 1 Force Conduit, which is going to reduce bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage that we take. And then at 5 stacks, if we take damage, we basically the shield explodes and deals 1d4 force damage in a 20-foot radius. But it's a pretty useful shield that will generally reduce a lot of damage that you might take. Then lastly, for our weapons or ranged weapons, we have the Giant Breaker. So when weapon hits hard enough to send your targets reeling for 2 turns. So this applies the same effect as armor, but we of course can stack 4 stacks onto our enemies with this, so they're most likely going to miss their first attack. Though keep in mind that as soon as the enemy misses, the reeling effect disappears, so you would need to reapply it with some other means. Then for the alternatives, we have a lot of crossbows here, right? Because the Ifan's whole shtick in Divinity Original Sin is that he basically he gets a special crossbow. Now, the closest thing to the special crossbow he gets in Divinity Original Sin is the crossbow Arcane Force, which is basically just a standard Githyanki crossbow that gains the Arcane Ammunition for 1 turn. Now, this is pretty bad. I would say this is the best used on a full fighter who gets 6 attack once you use Action Surge, so you can actually benefit from the 1d4 force damage the most. Of course, if you use this and then use arrow many targets, all of those other hits will deal this extra damage. So this would be probably the best again with the fighter that gets the improved extra attack. But for the other crossbows, a great one here is the Gandril's Aspiration. We have advantage against most thirsty type enemies. Usually I use this as a static weapon, but if you're fighting undead, the circuit munitions is actually really good there, especially if you manage to get your hands on the arrow of many targets. Then we have the Herald. So what happens is when you deal damage to the target with a ranged weapon, it must succeed a Charisma saving throw or become Bane for 2 turns. Bane is pretty good, gives them a penalty to attack rolls and saving throws, basically a reverse Bless. Then we have the Fabricated Arbalest, so enchantment +2, so it's a little bit more enchanted, higher accuracy and a little bit higher damage. It has the Illuminating Shot, so Fire Shimmering Bolt that inflicts 1 turn of Radiant Orb upon the target. It is a bonus action, which is pretty good, so you can still use your action to attack normally. And on top of that, you apply, of course, Radiant Orbs on them. So you can use stack Radiant Orbs as well as reeling on your enemies. And you also get the Dazzling Ray, which is a once per short rest effect. It's basically a much weaker version of the Sunbeam, right? It blinds targets and you can keep recasting it. And then lastly, we have the Hellfire Engine Crossbow, which is enchantment +2. We get a free Lightning Arrow once per long rest. And we also have the Reposition Malefactor. So what it does is, if the enemy fails the saving throw, you pull them 30 feet closer to you. So this will probably be very useful on more ranged characters when you want to pull enemies towards you, but it can still be useful on Ifan here. And then last thing I want to mention is I've been running the Elixir of Colossus. Elixir of Colossus works pretty well with ranged characters because it does apply to your ranged weapon attacks. Because it says here, weapons deal additional 1d4 damage, not just melee weapons. So this does work actually with your ranged attacks, which is going to increase your range damage even further with this. And it's going to be a little bit harder to move you because you gain advantage on straight checks and saving throws. Alright, so that is it for the equipment, and I'll see you in the combat showcase. Alright, so here we have the Flaming Fist barracks for yet another Baldur showcase. So before combat started, I did drink an Elixir of Colossus. I also got my Force Conduit from the shield. And I did throw a Potion of Healing on Ifan here so that he gets his weapon coated, so we deal extra 1d6 poison damage. So now, normally if, let's say there's a big group of enemies, you would potentially want to either use the Lightning Arrow, because it does have an AoE, or maybe even the Conjure Barrage, which you can choose ranged or melee, which again here, you can see ignores resistances because of our gloves. But since we're doing this for the sake of showcase, let's just shoot, which is going to be basically what we're going to be doing, I would say 90% of the game. So what we can do, let's target this guy. So our accuracy is relatively decent with the Sharpshooter all-in turned off. Now it's not as great as with some, for example, if you have the Deadshot longbow, which doubles your proficiency, then you can pretty much run this non-stop. But the whole idea with Ifan here is to run a crossbow. So instead of turning this on, which does reduce our accuracy quite a bit, we're gonna stand turned off, and let's use Hunter's Mark to see our accuracy then. So now we have a 95% on him, since of course we get a 1d4 bonus, and we get a, I don't know why the tooltip there is freaking out, but I recently switched to patch 8, so it's been starting doing that in patch 8, but that doesn't really matter anyway. We got it from 65 to 75, so we get 10% higher chance to hit, but we're not gonna do that. Instead, let's use the Piercing Shot. Let's see if he's gonna fail. Now he will succeed, so we'll use Cutting Word from our Bard here. And we were unlucky enough that he succeeded again, but that's fine. So we dealt around, well, a little bit over 30 damage to him. You can actually check here. So 25 from the piercing damage, and it's being re-rolled because of the Elixir of Colossus, if I'm not mistaken. We dealt maximum amount from our crossbow. 6 + 1, that's dexterity modifier and the weapon enchantment. Elixir of Colossus and the Hunter's Mark, which is the 1d6. So pretty good, decent damage. We rolled the maximum with the poison, which again got re-rolled because of the elixir. 2 damage from acid, and then 4 from the ring. Now what we can also do is, if you for example apply coating something like the Crawler Mucus, or for example the Malice, you could use just arrow many targets to try and apply it on as many enemies as possible. But in this case, since we only have we already applied the coating on our weapon, we don't need to do that, but we can check out damage. So pretty decent damage on this. We did manage to, I think we hit this guy 2 times somehow, because I'm guessing the bolt hit her, and it then tried to travel to this guy, but he was in the way and hit him. So he got hit twice, while she got hit once, but as you can see, all of them are reeling because the arrow main targets does transfer your crossbow's features onto it. So you can send a lot of enemies reeling, causing a lot of them to miss. But generally, that is it, how combat goes with Ifan here. Really straightforward and simple. Basically just kind of a vanilla ranger, right? But anyway, that is it. I hope you enjoyed. I would appreciate if you leave a like and subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I'll see you in the next one.